A lone rancher saved a wounded young Comanche woman, but 50 warriors appeared. The sun was beginning to dip low over the endless plains of Texas, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. The wind whispered softly through the tall, dry grass, carrying the scent of dust, wildflowers, and the distant river. Samuel Hayes rode slowly across his land, his horse's hooves making a steady rhythm against the hard earth. Samuel was a man who had spent most of his life alone. He had a small ranch, a modest cabin, and a handful of cattle that grazed on the open plains. The work was hard and unending, but it was honest, and he liked the quiet life. Most days he saw no one except the occasional traveler or trader passing by the trails. Samuel had learned to read the land like a book. He knew where the waterholes were, where the grass was greenest, and where predators might lurk. He had faced wild animals before, rustlers, and the harsh storms of Texas, but nothing had prepared him for what he was about to encounter. As he rode toward a distant water trough to refill his horse's canteen, a sudden movement caught his eye. At first he thought it was a deer or perhaps a coyote, but the figure moved differently. It limped, uneven and strained, as if each step caused pain. Samuel squinted against the sun. It was a young woman, and she was bleeding. A crimson stain had spread across the fabric of her clothing, and her skin was pale and streaked with dust. Samuel's heart tightened. He had seen many things in his life, but seeing a person in such danger on the open plains was rare. Instinct, something he could not explain, drove him forward. He guided his horse toward her, trying to make no sudden movements so as not to scare her. As he drew closer, he noticed her hair, dark and tangled, and the look in her eyes, fear, pain, but also a spark of fierce determination. "Hey there, are you hurt?" Samuel called softly, though he knew she might not understand his words. The woman paused and looked at him, her eyes narrowing in caution. Samuel dismounted, keeping his hands visible, and took a careful step toward her. He noticed the wound on her side. It was deep, and the blood had soaked through her clothing. Samuel's stomach turned, but he forced himself to stay calm. He had bandaged animals, even once a wild horse with a cut, but this was a human, someone completely helpless and in urgent need of care. Gently, Samuel lifted her into his arms, careful not to touch the wound directly. She tensed at first but made no sound. Samuel whispered softly, "I won't hurt you, you'll be safe." Her eyes studied him, wary, and then she relaxed just slightly, allowing him to carry her toward the cabin. Every step he took seemed heavy. The sun was still warm on his back, but Samuel barely noticed. His mind raced with questions. Who was she? How had she been injured? Was she alone? And most importantly, were there others who might come for her? By the time Samuel reached his cabin, the young woman was pale and weak. He laid her gently on a clean blanket inside, and she let out a faint sigh of relief. Samuel went to his small supplies, gathering clean cloths, water, and some basic herbs he used for wounds. He cleaned the gash carefully, washing away the dirt and blood. She flinched at first, but he murmured soft words, trying to calm her. He worked slowly, bandaging her with care, wrapping the cloth snugly but not too tight. The woman watched him quietly the entire time. Her eyes, dark and expressive, seemed to be measuring him, judging whether he could be trusted. Samuel had learned long ago that trust was earned, not demanded, especially in the lonely and dangerous places of the plains. He moved slowly, showing patience, and finally, after some time, she allowed him to sit beside her, offering her water from a small cup. She drank cautiously, glancing up at him but saying nothing. Night began to fall, and the sky turned a deep shade of blue, dotted with stars. Samuel lit a small fire outside, keeping the cabin dimly lit. The young woman remained inside, wrapped in the blanket. Samuel sat nearby, sharpening his hunting knife and listening to the wind. The plains were quiet now, except for the faint rustle of grass and the distant cry of a coyote. Even in this solitude, Samuel felt a tension in the air. He could sense that she was in danger, though he did not yet know from whom. Hours passed, and the young woman finally spoke, though not in words Samuel understood. Her language was foreign to him, but her tone carried urgency and fear. Samuel listened carefully, trying to mimic her gestures, pointing to the wound and then to the water and food he had provided. Slowly, she seemed to understand that he meant no harm. A small nod, almost imperceptible, signaled her acceptance of his help. Samuel allowed himself a sigh of relief. He brought her more water and some bread, careful to keep the atmosphere calm. The young woman ate slowly, her hands shaking, but she ate nonetheless. Samuel watched her closely, marveling at her resilience. Despite the injury and fear, she seemed strong, determined, and unbroken. He realized that she must have faced hardships before this day, that survival was not new to her. Throughout the night, Samuel thought of what he would do if others came looking for her. He had faced dangerous men before, but he had never faced a group that might arrive in the dead of night, skilled riders and fierce warriors who would not hesitate to act. He could only hope that his small cabin and the open land would provide some protection, at least until he could figure out a plan. As the hours slipped by, Samuel learned to communicate in small ways, gestures, nods, and expressions. He learned her name, Ahuli, by hearing it softly muttered while she rested. She would not speak more, but there was an understanding between them, a silent acknowledgement of trust and necessity. Samuel knew that tomorrow might bring challenges, but tonight, he focused on keeping her safe and comfortable. By midnight, the young woman had fallen into a light sleep, her breathing steady. Samuel sat by the fire, thinking of the vast plains stretching endlessly around his cabin. He had spent years alone, finding comfort in solitude, but this night felt different. There was a connection here, fragile and new, that made him feel alive in a way he had not felt for years. He promised himself that he would do everything in his power to protect her, no matter what might come. The wind shifted, carrying a scent unfamiliar to him, and Samuel's instincts sharpened. He felt the tension of the plains closing in. Somewhere beyond the horizon, others might be searching, and he would need every ounce of courage and wits to face them. Yet as he gazed into the firelight reflecting off Ahuli's dark hair, he felt a resolve he had never known before. He would not let fear guide him. He would act with care, patience, and courage. For now, in the quiet of the Texas night, a lone rancher and a wounded young Comanche woman found an uneasy peace, connected by circumstance and the human need for trust and safety. The night deepened, and the stars above shone bright and cold. Samuel thought of the long days ahead, of the questions unanswered, and of the uncertainty that awaited with the rising sun. But he also felt a strange sense of hope, fragile but real. He would face whatever came, for the young woman's life now rested in his hands, and he would not fail her. Morning came slowly over the Texas plains. The sky was a pale blue, and a soft breeze rustled through the tall grass, carrying the smell of wet earth from a distant river. Samuel Hayes woke before sunrise, his senses alert. He had barely slept, thinking about the young Comanche woman, Ahuli, who lay resting on the blankets inside his cabin. Her breathing was steady, but he could see the tension in her face even as she slept. Injured or not, she remained wary of him, her eyes flicking open whenever he moved too close. Samuel carefully checked the cabin and the surrounding area. Nothing seemed out of place, but he knew better than to trust the plains completely. Danger could come swiftly, in the form of animals or men who traveled in groups. He brewed a small pot of coffee over the fire and took a sip, letting the warm liquid chase away the stiffness in his muscles. He glanced toward the cabin, where Ahuli stirred. She opened her eyes slowly, meeting his gaze with caution. Samuel smiled gently, showing that he meant no harm. He brought her some water and a small piece of bread. She took it silently, her movements careful and deliberate. Samuel tried again to speak to her, pointing at the wound and then at himself, hoping she could understand his intent to help. She nodded slightly, and that small gesture felt like a victory. After breakfast, Samuel decided it was time to assess her injury more closely. He asked her to sit, and she agreed, though with visible hesitation. He carefully examined the cut on her side. It was healing slowly but needed cleaning and care each day to prevent infection. Samuel worked gently, explaining his actions with hand gestures and soft words. She winced at times, but she did not resist. Samuel felt a connection growing between them, not of friendship, perhaps, but of trust forged in the quiet understanding that life depended on cooperation. As the sun climbed higher, the wind brought distant noises that made Samuel's ears prick up. There was a sound of hooves far away, faint but unmistakable. He froze, listening. Ahuli's eyes widened at the sound too, and she immediately rose, her hand brushing the edge of the blanket as if preparing to run. Samuel held up a hand, signaling her to stay calm. He whispered in a low voice, "It's okay. We'll be careful." They stepped outside together. Samuel scanned the horizon. At first he saw nothing but the endless stretches of grass and scattered trees. Then a faint cloud of dust appeared far in the distance. Samuel's heart tightened. He had seen dust clouds like this before. They usually meant people or animals were moving quickly across the plains. His mind raced. Could it be a band of rustlers, or something more dangerous? Ahulai looked at him, her expression tense, and Samuel realized she understood much more than he had thought. She stepped closer to him, as if seeking his protection, though she remained alert. Samuel knew they had little time to prepare if danger approached. He quickly gathered what he could: a small rifle, some ammunition, and a leather satchel with basic supplies. He motioned for Ahulai to stay near the cabin and handed her a small bundle with water and some food. Hours passed, and the dust in the distance grew nearer. Samuel's nerves tightened with every heartbeat. The sound of hooves became clearer. Samuel knew that whoever was approaching was skilled and organized, moving with purpose. He kept Ahulai close, explaining through gestures that she must remain quiet and still. She nodded, her dark eyes wide with fear but trusting him enough to follow his instructions. Samuel's mind raced as he tried to predict their intentions. He knew she was a Comanche woman. The Comanche were proud, strong, and protective of their people. He had heard stories of their warriors' skill and courage, and he knew that 50 men could move across the plains quickly and with great coordination. He had no desire for conflict, yet he also could not abandon her. He had saved her life, and he intended to keep it that way. The first shadow of movement appeared near the edge of the tree line. Samuel could see horses moving in the distance, their riders mounted in perfect formation. His pulse quickened. He realized that this was no ordinary group. They were trained, disciplined, and aware of every detail of the terrain. Ahulai stiffened beside him, watching intently. Samuel felt a deep respect for her ability to sense danger long before he could. As the riders drew closer, Samuel thought of his options. He could attempt to hide, but the open plains offered little cover. He could flee, but he would only expose Ahulai to greater danger. The safest plan, he decided, was to show that he meant no harm while keeping her protected. He instructed her to stay behind the cabin while he stepped into view, rifle lowered but ready. The warriors emerged from the horizon, 50 strong, riding in perfect formation. Their painted faces, feathered headdresses, and decorated horses made them appear like a force born of the wind itself. Samuel held his ground, keeping his hands visible, and took a deep breath. He motioned for Ahulai to stay down and not make a sound. She obeyed, crouching behind the wooden cabin, her eyes never leaving the approaching riders. The leader of the group, an older man with a commanding presence, rode forward slightly, breaking from the formation. Samuel could see the intelligence in his eyes and the determination in the way he held his body. The leader stopped at a careful distance, observing Samuel and the cabin. Samuel raised a hand slowly, showing he had no intention to attack. The leader nodded slightly, but his gaze remained sharp, as if weighing every possible action. Samuel tried to communicate through gestures, pointing to Ahulai, then to himself, then to the cabin. He wanted to show that she was safe with him, that she was not a captive or in danger. The leader's eyes flicked to the cabin, then back to Samuel. Ahulai peeked out from behind the wooden structure, her eyes meeting the leader's. Samuel could see a moment of recognition in the leader's face. He realized that she had communicated something to him, and that for now, the situation remained uncertain. Hours seemed to stretch into an eternity. The wind shifted, carrying the sound of distant bird calls and the scent of grass and earth. Samuel stayed calm, his body tense but his mind sharp. He knew any sudden move could spark violence, but he also knew that showing fear would not help. He focused on breathing, on remaining steady, and on maintaining the silent understanding that his only goal was to protect the young woman. Slowly, the tension began to ease, though the danger was far from over. The leader signaled something to his group, and the riders halted, forming a semicircle around the cabin. Samuel realized that this was a test, a careful observation of his intentions. He remained still, waiting, hoping that his actions would be understood correctly. Ahulai's breathing was steady now, and she moved cautiously out from behind the cabin, showing that she trusted him. Samuel nodded, silently praising her courage. The leader of the warriors watched every movement closely, but Samuel could see that his judgment was not yet made. It would take time, patience, and careful observation for him to decide whether Samuel could be trusted. The sun climbed higher, warming the plains, and Samuel realized that the day would be long. The young woman's recovery was slow, and the warriors would remain vigilant. He knew that any mistake could spark conflict. He also knew that this moment was a test, not just of trust, but of courage, patience, and respect. Samuel sat near the cabin, keeping one eye on the young woman and the other on the approaching warriors. He prepared himself for whatever might come next, knowing that the choices he made in the next hours could change both their lives forever. The wind carried the distant sound of hooves and voices, a reminder that danger was near, but also that human understanding might prevail if met with honesty, courage, and care. As the day passed, Samuel and Ahuli found small ways to communicate. Gestures, expressions, and shared glances became their language. He learned a little about her strength, her resilience, and the world she came from. Though he could not speak her language, he could feel her determination, and she could sense his desire to help without causing harm. Together, they waited, watched, and learned from each other, preparing for the uncertain encounter that lay ahead. Even as the sun began to descend toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the plains, Samuel remained vigilant. The warriors had not yet approached the cabin directly, but he knew they were watching, studying, and deciding. He thought of the young woman's life, of the trust she had placed in him, and of the courage that had brought her to his doorstep. He resolved that he would do everything in his power to protect her, no matter what the coming hours might bring. The sun had climbed high into the sky, casting sharp shadows across the endless plains. Samuel Hayes kept a careful watch over his small cabin and the surrounding land. The young Comanche woman, Ahuli, stayed close to him, her dark eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of danger. Samuel could feel the tension in her every movement. She had been quiet since morning, but the way she shifted her weight and held herself told him that she could sense what he still could not. Something was coming, and then he saw it, a cloud of dust rising in the distance. This time it was much closer, and the sound of hooves pounding the hard earth reached Samuel's ears. He counted quickly in his head, estimating the number of riders. There were many, more than 10, more than 20, and certainly no less than 50. Samuel's pulse quickened, but he forced himself to remain calm. He had faced danger before, but nothing like this. This was a group of skilled warriors, fast, coordinated, and determined. Samuel motioned for Ahuli to remain behind the cabin. He could see the fear flicker in her eyes, but she obeyed. She crouched low, pressing herself against the wooden walls, her dark hair falling over her face. Samuel adjusted his stance, keeping his rifle ready, though he had no desire to fire unless it became absolutely necessary. His plan was simple: show that he meant no harm and hope that reason and respect would prevent violence. The first riders came into view. They were dressed in traditional Comanche clothing, their faces painted in colors that signified both strength and warning. Feathers adorned their hair and horses, and each warrior carried a bow, a spear, or a weapon carefully crafted for speed and accuracy. Samuel's heart pounded as he realized the magnitude of the group. These were not ordinary men. They were skilled, trained, and proud. The leader of the warriors rode ahead of the others. He was an older man with a calm yet commanding presence. His eyes, dark and sharp, scanned Samuel and the cabin with careful scrutiny. Samuel held his hands up in a gesture of peace and stepped slightly forward. The leader did not speak but raised a hand of his own, signaling for the others to stop. Samuel exhaled slowly. For now there was no immediate threat, but the tension was thick in the air. Ahuli peeked out from behind the cabin, her eyes locking with the leaders. Samuel noticed a moment of recognition pass between them, subtle but unmistakable. She spoke softly in her language, a string of words Samuel could not understand. The leader listened, nodding occasionally, and Samuel realized that she was explaining something important. Perhaps she was telling him that he meant no harm, or that she was under his care. Whatever the words, they seemed to calm the leader, if only slightly. The warriors slowly formed a semicircle around the cabin, leaving a clear space for Samuel to remain visible. Samuel stepped forward carefully, keeping his rifle lowered and his hands open. He pointed toward Ahuli, then to himself, then to the cabin, trying to show that she was safe and that he had no intention of capturing or hurting her. The leader's gaze never left him, but his body relaxed just a fraction. Samuel took this as a sign of hope. Hours passed in tense silence. The warriors did not advance, nor did they retreat. They studied him and the cabin carefully. Samuel remained still, though his mind raced with every possible scenario. If he moved too quickly, they might interpret it as aggression. If he hesitated too long, they might think he was hiding something. Every small gesture mattered, and Samuel realized that his survival, as well as Ahulai's, depended on understanding them as much as they were watching him. He glanced at Ahulai, who now stood just behind him. She was calm but alert, ready to move if needed. Samuel admired her courage. Despite the pain from her earlier injury and the fear of the approaching warriors, she did not cry out or flee. She trusted him enough to follow his lead, and that trust was a powerful bond that neither of them could ignore. Samuel noticed the way the warriors communicated with each other. Small hand signals, subtle nods, and brief words passed between them. It was clear that they were organized, disciplined, and watching not only him but the land, the cabin, and each other. He understood that this was more than a simple visit, it was a test. They were assessing his intentions, measuring his honesty, and deciding if he could be trusted. The leader rode closer, breaking from the formation. Samuel's heart raced, but he remained calm. He gestured to Ahulai, then to the supplies and blankets he had prepared for her, showing that he had been caring for her needs. The leader circled slowly, studying Samuel's face and movements. Samuel met his gaze steadily, refusing to show fear. In moments like this, courage was not loud or brash. It was steady, calm, and honest. After what seemed like an eternity, the leader stopped and dismounted. He walked toward Samuel with careful, deliberate steps. Samuel stayed where he was, keeping his hands visible and his posture non-threatening. The leader examined Ahulai from a distance, then glanced at Samuel. Finally, he spoke in a few words Samuel could not understand. He gestured for Samuel to come closer, and Samuel did so cautiously, still keeping Ahulai in sight. The leader looked at the wound on Ahulai's side, then back at Samuel. He studied the cabin, the supplies, and the small gestures of care that Samuel had made. Slowly, he seemed to make a decision. He pointed toward Samuel, then to Ahulai, then raised his hand in a slow, deliberate nod. Samuel understood the gesture. For now, they would allow the young woman to remain with him. It was a fragile agreement, but it was enough to prevent immediate violence. The other warriors remained in formation, watching silently. Samuel knew that this was only temporary. They would continue to observe, waiting for any sign of betrayal or harm. He had to be careful, patient, and respectful. He motioned for Ahulai to come closer, and she obeyed, stepping out from behind the cabin. She approached cautiously, but there was a quiet relief in her expression. Samuel handed her a small piece of bread and water, and she accepted it, nodding slightly in gratitude. As the day wore on, Samuel and Ahulai found small ways to communicate. He pointed to the wound, then to himself, then to his supplies, showing that he was only helping. She responded with gestures and brief words, teaching him her name and a few important signs. Though they could not speak the same language fully, they had found a way to understand each other. The leader watched every movement, occasionally signaling to the other warriors. Samuel realized that respect, patience, and courage were as important as any weapon. He could not fight 50 skilled warriors, but he could show honesty and care. That simple truth was the key to keeping Ahulai safe. By late afternoon, the sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the plains. Samuel took a deep breath and glanced at Ahulai. She had regained some color in her face and seemed steadier on her feet. He knew that soon she would need to return to her people, but for now, they had a fragile peace. The warriors, still alert, began to relax slightly, their formation loosening as they seemed to accept Samuel's good intentions. The plains were quiet now, except for the distant sound of hooves and the occasional bird call. Samuel and Ahulai sat near the cabin, sharing a moment of quiet connection. They did not speak much, but their presence together was enough. Samuel realized that the day had been long, filled with tension and uncertainty, but also with the beginnings of trust and understanding. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Samuel looked at the distant riders, their silhouettes outlined by the fading light. He knew that the real test was not over, but he also knew that courage, respect, and patience had carried him this far. He had faced fear, uncertainty, and the unknown, and he had survived. More importantly, he had protected the young woman who had come to his cabin in need. The evening brought cool winds, rustling the tall grass and carrying the scent of the river. Samuel sat by the cabin with Ahulai, keeping watch on the horizon. The warriors had not moved closer, but Samuel remained vigilant. He knew that tomorrow would bring more decisions, more tests, and perhaps the chance for Ahuli to return safely to her people. For now, he focused on the present, keeping her safe, maintaining the fragile peace, and preparing for whatever the next day might bring. Even as darkness fell, Samuel felt a strange sense of accomplishment. He had faced the unknown with calm and courage. He had earned, in some small measure, the respect of the Comanche warriors. And he had forged a bond with Ahuli that was built on trust, care, and the shared understanding that life, no matter the danger, was worth protecting. The next morning, the sun rose over the Texas plains with a soft, golden light, illuminating the vast stretches of grass and scattered trees. Samuel Hayes was already awake, as was his habit, sitting outside his cabin and watching the horizon. The plains were quiet, but the tension that had filled the air yesterday still lingered. Samuel's eyes scanned the distance, alert for any sign of movement. Ahuli had slept restlessly, tossing slightly under her blanket, and now she sat up, rubbing the sleep from her eyes and watching him carefully. Samuel approached her gently and offered a small piece of bread and a cup of water. She accepted it silently, her movements cautious but steady. He nodded reassuringly, showing her that everything was as calm as it could be. The two had spent hours communicating through gestures and simple signs, learning to understand each other without words. Samuel had learned her name, Ahuli, and she had begun to trust him more, though the memory of being pursued still haunted her eyes. By mid-morning, a distant sound of hooves reached them. Samuel stiffened, but Ahuli's reaction was sharper. She stood immediately, her body tense, and pointed toward the horizon. Samuel followed her gaze and saw the cloud of dust rising in the distance. The Comanche warriors were approaching again, riding steadily across the plains. This time they were closer, and Samuel could see the detail in their clothing, the feathers in their hair, and the determination in their movements. He motioned for Ahuli to stay behind the cabin, and she crouched down quickly, her eyes wide with caution. Samuel stepped forward to meet the approaching leader, holding his hands visible and his rifle lowered. The leader rode ahead of the group, his gaze sharp and calculating. Samuel could feel the weight of 50 pairs of eyes upon him, all watching, judging, assessing. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to remain calm. The leader dismounted at a careful distance and began to speak in his language. Samuel could not understand the words, but he could sense their meaning through the tone and gestures. The leader pointed to Ahuli, then to Samuel, then to the cabin, as if asking why the young woman was there and what Samuel intended. Samuel raised his hands and pointed to her wound, then to the supplies he had prepared, showing that he had been caring for her, not harming her. Ahuli stepped forward cautiously, her eyes meeting the leader's. She spoke softly, her words calm but urgent. Samuel could not understand, but the leader listened carefully, nodding slowly. Samuel realized that Ahuli was vouching for him, explaining to her people that he meant no harm. The tension in the air was palpable, but there was a shift, slow, subtle, but real. The leader's posture relaxed slightly, and he signaled to the other warriors to hold their position. Samuel motioned for Ahuli to come closer, and she obeyed, stepping out from behind the cabin. He handed her a small cup of water, which she accepted with a nod. Samuel noticed a small smile flicker on her lips, a sign of trust and relief. The leader watched them both carefully, making slow, deliberate gestures. Samuel understood that this was a critical moment. He had to act with patience, courage, and respect if he wanted to ensure Ahuli's safety. The warriors began to move closer, still forming a semicircle around the cabin. Samuel kept his movements slow and steady, showing that he had nothing to hide. He gestured toward Ahuli again, pointing to the blankets, the food, and the water, emphasizing that she had been under his care. The leader nodded, signaling the warriors to observe carefully but not to attack. Samuel felt a glimmer of hope. Hours passed in tense quiet. Samuel and Ahuli sat near the cabin, finding comfort in small gestures. A nod, a glance, a smile. They could not speak the same language fully, but they understood each other through actions and expressions. Samuel offered her more water and bread, and she accepted, her trust growing with every passing moment. The warriors remained vigilant, but their stance was less rigid than before. Samuel knew that respect, patience, and courage had earned him this fragile peace. Suddenly, a young warrior broke formation, riding toward Samuel and Ahuli at a brisk pace. Samuel's heart raced, but he remained calm. The warrior approached cautiously, slowing his horse near the cabin. He spoke to the leader, pointing toward Samuel, then gesturing toward the cabin and the young woman. The leader listened and nodded, signaling the other warriors to wait. Samuel realized that this was a test of communication, trust, and intention. He stepped forward, holding his hands visible. He gestured for Ahuli to stay behind him and motioned toward the supplies, showing that she was cared for. The young warrior studied him carefully, then glanced at the leader. After a tense moment, he nodded slightly and returned to the formation. Samuel exhaled slowly, relieved. The encounter had passed without conflict, but he knew the real test was not over. As the sun climbed higher, Samuel noticed the warriors adjusting their positions. They were still on guard, still assessing him, but their movements were more deliberate and less threatening. Samuel took the opportunity to communicate more with Ahuli, using gestures to teach her simple words and expressions, and learning her signs in return. They shared small moments of understanding, laughter, and relief, strengthening the fragile bond that had formed between them. The leader rode closer once more, stopping just short of the cabin. He gestured toward Samuel and then toward Ahuli, speaking in his language. Samuel watched carefully, trying to interpret the meaning. Ahuli's eyes lit up, and she nodded quickly, indicating that she understood. The leader then gestured for Samuel to come forward and kneel slightly, a sign of respect and acknowledgement. Samuel complied, showing that he recognized the leader's authority and meant no harm. The tension in the air eased slightly, but Samuel knew it was only temporary. The warriors would remain vigilant until they were fully convinced that Samuel's intentions were honest and that Ahuli's safety was secure. Samuel focused on patience, respect, and careful observation. Every gesture mattered, every expression could influence the outcome. He moved slowly, deliberately, and with sincerity, showing that his only concern was the well-being of the young woman. Hours passed in careful observation. Samuel and Ahuli remained near the cabin, sharing small moments of quiet connection. Samuel offered her water, bread, and comfort, and she accepted with gratitude. The warriors observed from a distance, occasionally signaling to each other, communicating in ways Samuel could not fully understand. Yet he could sense that their assessment was leaning in his favor. By late afternoon, the sun began to cast long shadows across the plains. Samuel glanced at Ahuli, who had regained some strength and color. She moved more confidently, her eyes bright with cautious hope. Samuel realized that they had survived the critical test. The warriors were still present, but their stance had softened. Respect, patience, and courage had bridged the gap between two worlds that had met under tension and uncertainty. Samuel and Ahuli sat near the cabin, watching the distant horizon. The warriors remained at a distance, their silhouettes outlined by the fading light. Samuel knew that the young woman would soon return to her people, but for now, they shared a moment of peace, understanding, and trust. He had faced fear, uncertainty, and the unknown, and he had survived. More importantly, he had protected the young woman and earned the fragile respect of the warriors who had come to assess him. As night fell, the plains were quiet, except for the soft rustle of grass and the distant calls of animals. Samuel and Ahuli sat near the fire, reflecting silently on the day. The bond they had formed was fragile but real, built on trust, courage, and mutual respect. Samuel realized that the events of this day had changed him. He had faced fear and uncertainty with patience and honesty, and he had emerged stronger and more aware of the value of human connection. The leader of the warriors finally spoke in a low voice, gesturing toward Samuel and Ahuli. Though Samuel could not understand the words, he could see the approval in the gestures and expressions. The young woman's presence had been acknowledged, her safety assured, and Samuel's actions had been recognized as honest and protective. The tension that had filled the air earlier in the day had eased, replaced by cautious understanding. As darkness enveloped the plains, Samuel and Ahuli shared a quiet meal. He offered her bread and water, and she accepted with a small smile. The warriors remained nearby, vigilant but non-threatening, their respect for Samuel clear in their careful observation. Samuel understood that this was only temporary, but for now, they had achieved a fragile peace that would allow the young woman to recover further before returning to her people. The night was calm, the stars shining brightly overhead. Samuel and Ahuli sat near the fire, sharing a moment of quiet connection. Words were not necessary. Trust, respect, and courage had spoken louder than language. Samuel knew that the coming days would bring more challenges, but he also knew that patience, honesty, and understanding had carried them this far. As he watched Ahuli rest peacefully for the first time in days, Samuel felt a sense of relief and hope. He had faced a critical turning point, a test of courage and integrity, and he had survived. More importantly, he had protected a young woman who had been in danger and earned the fragile trust of 50 skilled warriors. The events of this day would stay with him forever, a reminder that respect, patience, and courage could bridge even the widest divides between people. The morning air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of dew and wild grass across the Texas plains. Samuel Hayes awoke before sunrise, as was his habit, and immediately looked toward the horizon. The sky was painted in soft shades of pink and gold, and for a moment the vast emptiness of the plains felt calm and peaceful. But Samuel knew that today would bring change. The young Comanche woman, Ahuli, had regained much of her strength, and soon she would return to her people. The thought filled him with a mixture of relief and sadness. Ahuli stirred on the blankets inside the cabin. She looked rested, her breathing steady, and her face showed the first real signs of recovery since the day Samuel had found her. She had grown stronger, more confident, but there was still a quiet tension in her movements. Samuel approached her gently, offering a small piece of bread and water. She accepted with a nod, her eyes meeting his with a quiet gratitude that did not need words. They had spent days learning to communicate through gestures, expressions, and small actions. Their bond had grown quietly, built on trust, patience, and care. The distant sound of hooves reached Samuel's ears. He stiffened slightly, but Ahuli reacted first. She rose quickly, brushing the blanket from her legs and moving near the cabin door. Samuel followed, ready to meet whatever challenge might come. The Comanche warriors had returned, their presence both familiar and commanding. They rode steadily across the plains, their feathers and painted faces catching the morning light. Samuel counted carefully, 50 strong, disciplined, and alert. He could sense the watchful eyes upon him, assessing, judging, deciding. The leader of the warriors rode ahead of the others. His gaze was fixed on Samuel and Ahuli. Samuel stepped forward, keeping his hands visible and his rifle lowered. He nodded in greeting, showing that he had no intention of conflict. The leader's expression was stern but calm, and for a moment, Samuel felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. Today was the day Ahuli would return to her people, and he needed to ensure it happened safely and peacefully. Ahuli stepped forward, her movements confident but cautious. She approached Samuel and took a small bag with food and water he had prepared for her journey. Samuel motioned for her to stay calm and followed her lead, showing respect to the warriors. The leader watched them carefully, then signaled for a small group of warriors to approach. They rode slowly, forming a corridor that would guide Ahuli safely back to the larger group. Samuel understood the gesture. It was both a sign of trust and a reminder that the warriors were protective and vigilant. Samuel turned to Ahuli, using gestures to communicate. He pointed to her side, showing he had cared for her wound. He pointed to her, then to the warriors, showing that she would be safe among her people. Ahuli nodded, understanding his meaning. She looked at him with a mixture of gratitude and sadness, as if acknowledging that their time together was coming to an end. Samuel felt a pang of emotion. He had spent days protecting her, sharing moments of quiet understanding, and now he would have to say goodbye. The leader of the warriors dismounted and approached Samuel carefully. Samuel lowered himself slightly in a respectful gesture. The leader spoke in his language, and though Samuel could not understand the words, he recognized the tone approval, acknowledgement, and permission. The warriors began to move closer to Ahuli, forming a protective circle around her. Samuel stepped back, giving her space while remaining vigilant. He wanted to ensure that no harm came to her, even as he prepared to let her go. Ahuli looked at Samuel one last time before the leader gestured for her to mount her horse. She climbed carefully, steadying herself as the rider handed her the reins. Samuel watched her, his heart full. The young woman who had arrived injured and alone was now strong, capable, and about to return to her people. He felt pride in her courage and relief that his efforts had ensured her safety. He also felt a quiet sadness, knowing that their brief time together was ending. The warriors began to ride slowly, keeping Ahuli in the center of their formation. Samuel stood by the cabin, watching as they moved across the plains. Dust rose from the hooves of the horses, glinting in the morning sunlight. The wind carried the sound of their movement, a rhythm that seemed to mark both an ending and a beginning. Samuel felt a sense of peace, knowing that she was safe, but he could not help but linger, wishing he could speak words that might convey everything he felt. Ahuli glanced back at Samuel once more, her eyes meeting his. She raised her hand in a small wave, and Samuel returned it, holding it a little longer than necessary. It was a gesture of thanks, recognition, and farewell. The leader of the warriors nodded at Samuel, acknowledging his care and courage. Samuel lowered his hand, feeling the weight of the moment settle around him. The bond they had shared, though brief, had been profound, a connection built on trust, understanding, and shared humanity. As the warriors and Ahuli disappeared into the distance, Samuel remained standing, gazing at the horizon. The plains stretched endlessly before him, vast and silent. He reflected on the events of the past days, the fear, the tension, the uncertainty, and the courage required to navigate it all. He realized that true bravery was not just in facing danger, but in showing respect, patience, and compassion, even in the most uncertain situations. Samuel returned to his cabin, feeling a mixture of relief and emptiness. The work of caring for Ahuli had filled his days with purpose and connection, and now the silence of the plains seemed heavier. He moved slowly, performing his usual tasks, but with a new awareness. Every fence he repaired, every water trough he checked, every animal he tended carried the memory of the young woman who had trusted him and the warriors who had recognized his honesty. The night came, quiet and cool, with stars glittering above like scattered diamonds. Samuel sat outside by a small fire, reflecting on the lessons he had learned. Courage and patience had been tested. Trust had been earned. Respect had bridged the gap between two worlds that had met under tension and uncertainty. And most importantly, life had been protected through care, understanding, and the willingness to act with honesty. Days passed, and Samuel continued his life on the ranch, but he was forever changed. He thought often of Ahuli and her people, hoping she had returned safely and that she would remember him not as a stranger, but as someone who had cared for her when she needed help most. He realized that even in the quiet life of the plains, events could unfold that tested courage, humanity, and connection in ways he had never imagined. One evening, as Samuel watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, he imagined the young woman riding with her people, strong and free. He smiled, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction and gratitude. Though their time together had been short, it had left a lasting impact on both of them. The trust they had built, the courage they had shared, and the understanding between two very different lives would remain a memory he would carry forever. The wind shifted, rustling the tall grass and carrying the faint scent of the distant river. Samuel took a deep breath, feeling the vastness of the plains around him and the quiet strength within himself. He had faced fear, uncertainty, and the unknown. He had protected a life in danger and honored the trust placed in him. And in doing so, he had discovered something profound, that courage, kindness, and respect could overcome even the greatest divides. As night settled fully over the plains, Samuel prepared for bed with a sense of peace. The world outside his cabin was vast and sometimes harsh, but he knew that honesty, care, and patience could make it safer and better. He looked at the stars, thinking of Ahuli and the journey she continued, and he felt a quiet hope that one day paths might cross again. For now, he slept knowing that he had done what was right, and that was enough. The plains remained silent, but Samuel's heart was full. The story of a lone rancher and a young Comanche woman would be remembered not in words, but in the quiet actions of courage, trust, and humanity that had shaped their lives forever. And as the night carried on, he dreamed not of danger or fear, but of connection, hope, and the enduring strength of the human spirit.